For the first time in 6 years, a bipartisan delegation of U.S. lawmakers has landed in Beijing. Their mission? Not sanctions, not threats, not fiery rhetoric, but dialogue. They came with a message to Premier Li Qiang. It's time to break the ice. It may sound simple, but in the stormy history of U.S.-China relations, moments like this are rare, and they can change the trajectory of global politics. What happens in these rooms doesn't stay in Beijing. It ripples through stock markets in New York, factories in Shenzhen, trading floors in London, and ports from Rotterdam to Singapore. When the U.S. and China talk, the world listens, because when they fight, the world pays. To understand why this visit matters, we have to rewind. The U.S. and China have spent the past decade drifting from cautious cooperation to open confrontation. Trade wars erupted under President Trump in 2018, with tariffs on over $360 billion worth of Chinese goods, from steel to electronics. China retaliated, hitting American soybeans, cars, and aircraft. Multinational corporations were caught in the crossfire, forced to reroute supply chains or swallow higher costs. At the same time, the U.S. began restricting Chinese access to advanced technology, particularly semiconductors. Washington accused Beijing of intellectual property theft and espionage. In response, China doubled down on self-sufficiency, pouring billions into chipmaking and tightening its control over critical minerals. The rivalry extended beyond economics. Military maneuvers in the South China Sea, tensions over Taiwan, diplomatic battles at the United Nations. By 2020, with COVID-19 fueling mistrust, the relationship was in free fall. And then came years of silence. No high-level congressional visits, no breakthrough summits, just tariffs, sanctions, and suspicion. That is why this September 2025 delegation matters. On the eve of the UN General Assembly, Presidents Donald Trump and Xi Jinping spoke by phone. Trump emphasized the need to resolve the TikTok standoff, a Chinese-owned app facing bans in the U.S. over national security concerns. Xi insisted China would not surrender its algorithm, but agreed dialogue was essential. Just days later, on September 21st, lawmakers from the House of Representatives, Republicans and Democrats together, arrived in Beijing, led by Representative Adam Smith. Their meeting with Premier Li Qiang was carefully choreographed but symbolically powerful. Li welcomed them warmly, saying the visit could stabilize and improve U.S.-China relations, adding that cooperation was better than confrontation. Reuters described it as the first such visit since 2019, a sign that both sides want to test the waters for a reset. Reuters, September 21, 2025. The facts are straightforward. This is the first U.S. House delegation in Beijing in 6 years. The group included senior Armed Services Committee members, underlining that security, not just trade, was on the agenda. They discussed issues from technology exports to maritime disputes, from tariffs to Taiwan. Premier Li's tone was conciliatory, urging dialogue to manage differences and prevent miscalculations. The lawmakers, for their part, pressed for military-to-military communication and raised concerns about cyber intrusions and unfair trade practices. No agreements were signed, but in diplomacy, sometimes the conversation itself is the breakthrough. The political and economic implications are wide-ranging. For Washington, the visit shows that even in a polarized Congress, there is consensus on the importance of direct engagement with Beijing. It gives the Trump administration cover against accusations of neglecting diplomacy while pursuing an aggressive tariff strategy. For Beijing, welcoming the delegation helps soften its image abroad, especially as it faces criticism over human rights and assertive foreign policy. But not everyone benefits. Hardliners in both capitals view the thaw as risky. In the U.S., security hawks warn against trusting Beijing, arguing that easing restrictions could compromise national security. In China, nationalist voices argue the U.S. cannot be trusted and that concessions would be weakness. Still, for businesses and investors, the sight of Americans and Chinese talking face-to-face is a rare bit of optimism. For ordinary people, the stakes are real. A tech worker in California knows chip restrictions could cost jobs if supply chains remain fractured. A farmer in Iowa knows tariffs on soybeans mean fewer exports to China, the world's largest buyer. A consumer in Europe knows U.S.-China tension drives up the price of electronics. In Shanghai, an entrepreneur wonders if her startup will ever gain access to Western markets again. Each tariff, each restriction, each diplomatic freeze trickles down to real households. That is why markets watch these visits so closely. Globally, the angle is even bigger. Asian nations like Vietnam, South Korea, and Malaysia are caught between the giants. They benefit when trade flows smoothly, but suffer when Washington and Beijing clash. A thaw could ease pressure on regional supply chains and reduce the risk of military missteps in contested waters. Europe watches carefully too. The European Union has often resisted U.S. calls for a united front against China, preferring engagement over confrontation. If U.S.-China relations stabilize, Europe could focus on trade diversification without choosing sides. Meanwhile, developing economies from Africa to Latin America rely on both American finance and Chinese infrastructure. For them, U.S.-China hostility is a nightmare scenario. A working relationship, even a fragile one, is a lifeline. There are historical parallels. During the Cold War, even bitter rivals like the U.S. and Soviet Union found value in dialogue. Nixon's 1972 trip to China reshaped geopolitics, showing that engagement can sometimes be more powerful than containment. Today, with two economies that account for nearly 40% of global GDP, the stakes are arguably even higher. A misstep over Taiwan could trigger global recession. A breakdown over technology standards could splinter the digital economy. Conversely, a stable channel of communication could prevent crises and keep the global economy from fracturing further. What comes next? Several scenarios are possible. In the optimistic case, this delegation opens the door to a Trump-Xi summit later this year, producing agreements on TikTok's future, partial tariff reductions, or frameworks for semiconductor trade. That could calm markets and encourage global growth. In a more cautious scenario, the visit remains symbolic. Dialogue continues, but tariffs remain, tech bans remain, Taiwan tensions remain. The relationship stays cold, but not frozen. In the worst case, talks collapse. A new tariff announcement, a clash in the South China Sea, or a flare-up in Taiwan could undo this fragile progress overnight. That is why this moment is fragile, and why everyone from Brussels to Tokyo is watching closely. And so we arrive at the question that matters most. Is this visit a turning point or just a photo opportunity? Will Washington and Beijing move toward pragmatic compromise or drift back into rivalry cloaked in polite words? In an age of tech wars and tariff battles, the world is desperate for stability. Yet history tells us great power competition rarely resolves neatly. So here is the cliffhanger. In the struggle for global leadership, will the U.S. and China learn to share influence? Or will today's handshake be tomorrow's headline in a story about confrontation?